Characters definitely don't need traumatic backstories in order to be interesting. And in fact, I would say that you shouldn't rely on traumatic backstories to make your characters interesting, because that very often doesn't work. It's easy to write a traumatic backstory. It's a lot harder to write a character who is interesting to read about. And just because they have a traumatic backstory, a traumatic childhood, that doesn't mean that they're going to be interesting to read about. I'd say that the most important thing in crafting an interesting character is giving them choices. That is what really builds character, really shows us who your character is. Give them a choice and let us see what they choose and why they choose that. Another important thing is to give them something that they want, something they're striving for, something they're willing to make sacrifices for. And it should be a selfish want. Their only want should not be world peace or taking care of their little sister or something like that. It's fine for them to also want those things, but give them something they want that's just for them. That will make them so much more interesting. And another thing is complicated relationships. And I mean relationships that started before the story began. Complicated relationships with parents or siblings or friends or coworkers or enemies or anyone, really. A character's relationships will show us so much about who they are, and they're also often fun to read about. Reading about characters who have a history together, that's fun. Now, of course, your character should also be shaped by their past, but that doesn't mean it has to be traumatic. I feel like these days we throw around the word trauma very loosely, but not everything is trauma. Not even everything upsetting is trauma, right? Just because your character's childhood wasn't perfect doesn't mean it was traumatic. Just because your character had a bad breakup doesn't mean it was traumatic. Just because they failed at something they really wanted to do doesn't mean that was trauma. These things should all shape who they are, but they shouldn't be treated like traumatic events. And even if your character does have a genuinely traumatic backstory, that doesn't mean you don't have to work on making them interesting in the present in their own right. The traumatic backstory should be something extra, something to make us understand them even more, root for them even more. It should not be the sole reason we're rooting for them, the sole reason we find them interesting.